The walls of a hospital hold many stories. Some end in miracles. Others in heartbreak. Doctors and nurses walk these hallways, carrying the weight of life and death in their hands. Families place their trust in those white coats, believing that no matter the odds, the people inside these walls will fight to save their loved ones. Now, imagine a nurse standing at a patient's bedside. His hands move swiftly, adjusting in 4-line, checking vitals, preparing medication. He has done this countless times before. A guardian of the weak. A healer in the making. His colleagues see a man dedicated to his profession, one who stays late, who steps in when others hesitate. Patients' families whisper their gratitude. Some even request him by name, believing he is their best chance at survival. And yet, time and time again, something unexplainable happens. A patient, stable just moments ago, gasps for breath. Alarms blare. Monitors flash erratic numbers. A heartbeat that was strong now fades, slipping away too fast. The nurse doesn't panic. Instead, he moves with purpose. A syringe. A desperate effort to bring them back. Hands pressing against a lifeless chest. A race against time. And when the pulse returns, when the patient's eyes flutter open, relief spreads across the room. His peers see a hero. A man who defied the odds. They call it luck. They call it skill. But the truth was far from it. Because those moments weren't coincidences. They weren't strokes of bad luck, nor the natural course of a fragile body giving in. They were orchestrated. Crafted. Controlled. And the man standing at the center of it all wasn't saving lives. He was choosing when to take them. This is the story of Niels Högel. A nurse who thrived on the chaos of resuscitation, who injected patients with lethal doses of medication just to bring them back, until one day, he didn't. And for over a decade, hospitals turned a blind eye. Dozens of families buried their loved ones, never knowing that the person they had trusted to save them was the very reason they never made it home. By the time the truth came to light, the death toll had risen beyond comprehension. What happened inside those hospital walls would go down in history as one of the most chilling medical crimes ever uncovered. And the most terrifying part? It could have been stopped. Niels Högel was born on December 30, 1976, in Wilhelmshaven, a coastal town in northwestern Germany. His childhood was unremarkable, his upbringing seemingly ordinary. His father was a nurse, and from an early age, Högel followed in his footsteps, fascinated by the idea of saving lives. Those who knew him back then remember a boy who was quiet but friendly, never one to stand out. In the late 1990s, Högel entered nursing school, training in emergency medicine and intensive care. It was a noble profession, one that demanded skill, compassion, and unwavering dedication. And at first glance, Högel seemed to have all three. By 1999, he secured a position at Oldenburg Hospital, a respected facility in Lower Saxony. At just 23 years old, he was one of the youngest in his unit. Colleagues found him enthusiastic, always willing to stay late, to take on extra shifts. Families of patients spoke highly of him, describing a nurse who appeared to go above and beyond. But what they didn't know, what no one could have suspected, was that this eagerness wasn't driven by compassion. It was something else entirely. Something no one had seen coming. Between 1999 and 2002, Niels Högel worked at Oldenburg Hospital's intensive care unit. His colleagues there would later recall an unsettling pattern, an unusual number of cardiac arrests occurring during his shifts. Patients who had been stable would suddenly decline. Alarms would sound. Doctors and nurses would rush in. And standing in the center of it all, Högel. Then, in 2003, he moved to Delmenhorst Hospital, a smaller facility about 40 kilometers away. Here, the pattern continued. Even worsened. But this time, it didn't go unnoticed. Some nurses whispered among themselves. Others raised concerns. Because somehow, whenever Högel was on duty, patients who should have lived, didn't. In 2005, a nurse at Delmenhorst Hospital made a chilling observation: Högel was always present when resuscitations were needed. He was the common denominator in a disturbing number of cases. When an internal investigation was launched, a staggering fact emerged: during his shifts, the mortality rate was nearly double that of any other nurse on staff. Högel's own colleagues began taking note of his behavior. One remembered seeing him lingering around patients just moments before they coded. Another recalled him injecting something into an IV bag before walking away. Yet, even with mounting concerns, there was no formal accusation. No immediate action. Because who would believe that a nurse, someone trained to heal, could be responsible for such horrors? But then, on one fateful day in June 2005, someone did see it. And this time, they refused to stay silent. A fellow nurse at Delmenhorst Hospital had seen enough. On that day, she walked into a room and caught Niels Högel in the act. He had just injected a patient with an unauthorized drug. It was the confirmation they had feared, the proof they could no longer ignore. Högel was immediately confronted, his access to medication restricted. But the patient he had injected did not survive. And for the first time, an official report was filed. A report that would unravel one of the deadliest medical crimes in modern history. But what investigators didn't yet realize, what no one had even begun to grasp, was that this was only the beginning. By the time they started digging into his past, it was already too late for more than 100 victims. And the worst part? The deaths that could have been prevented, if only someone had listened sooner. Between 1999 and 2005, inside the sterile walls of two German hospitals, Niels Högel was not just a caregiver. He was something far more dangerous. His patients, many of them elderly, weak, and vulnerable, trusted him. Their families believed they were in safe hands. Högel worked the intensive care units, where every second counted, where patients hovered between life and death. It was here that he found his method, a twisted routine that transformed him from an ordinary nurse into a silent executioner. His weapon? Medication. Specifically, drugs like ajmalin, sotalol, and lidocaine, substances used to treat heart conditions. In controlled doses, they were life-saving. But in excess, they induced rapid cardiac arrest. Högel knew this. And he used it to his advantage. He didn't do it for money. He didn't do it out of hatred. He did it because he craved the power, the rush of bringing a patient to the brink of death, only to pull them back at the last second. He enjoyed the applause, the admiration, the whispered praise that followed when he single-handedly saved a life. But Högel wasn't always successful. When resuscitations failed, when his victims succumbed to the very drugs he administered, there were no celebrations. Just quiet funerals. Families left with questions that had no answers. By the time his tenure at Oldenburg ended in 2002, records would later suggest he had already killed dozens. But no one had stopped him. Instead, he had been given a fresh start. Oldenburg Hospital had seen the pattern. Death rates had risen sharply during Högel's shifts. Senior staff had noticed. And yet, instead of investigating, instead of alerting authorities, they chose another path. They asked him to leave. No charges were filed. No warnings were issued to other hospitals. Högel walked away without a blemish on his record. Within months, he secured a new job at Delmenhorst Hospital. And the killings resumed. In Delmenhorst, it didn't take long for suspicions to surface again. Patients who should have been stable were dying at an alarming rate. Colleagues noticed that every time a patient coded unexpectedly, Högel was nearby. One nurse, who had worked alongside him, later recalled how she had once walked into a patient's room and found Högel alone, standing over the IV line. The patient, moments later, went into cardiac arrest. She reported it. Others did too. Again, nothing happened. Hospital management feared the consequences of an internal scandal. They dismissed the concerns as paranoia, as unfounded accusations. Patients continued to die. And Högel remained free to do what he did best, play God. It would take another year before someone finally saw what had been happening all along. In June 2005, a fellow nurse walked in on Högel injecting an unidentified substance into a patient's foreline. She froze, her mind racing. The patient had been stable minutes ago. There was no reason for an injection. She didn't just ignore it. She reported him immediately. The patient coded. He did not survive. This time, the hospital could no longer look away. Högel was confronted. And at last, the authorities were called. When police arrived at Delmenhorst Hospital, they expected a case of medical malpractice. Perhaps negligence. What they found was something far worse. An internal audit revealed that the mortality rate during Högel's shifts was nearly triple the normal rate. In one unit alone, half of the resuscitations had taken place when he was on duty. The numbers were staggering. The evidence undeniable. But no one could have imagined the true scale of his crimes. Because as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a horrifying truth: Högel had been killing for years. And the body count was only just beginning to be counted. The walls were closing in on Niels Högel. The nurse who had spent years playing the hero was about to face the consequences of his own making. But just how many lives had he taken? And how had he managed to evade justice for so long? By 2005, the whispers had grown louder. Nurses and doctors at Delmenhorst Hospital had long suspected that something was wrong, but without direct evidence, their hands were tied. Then, one night, the truth finally came into the light. A nurse on shift walked into a patient's room and stopped in her tracks. There, standing over the foreline, was Niels Högel. A syringe in his hand. The patient, moments earlier stable, suddenly convulsed. The heart monitor wailed, a distress call no one could ignore. The nurse's pulse pounded. She didn't hesitate. She ran to get help. The patient was lucky. Unlike so many others before, this one survived. And Högel had been caught. Red-handed. The police wasted no time. Högel was arrested, but the question loomed: just how many had died at his hands? At first, investigators combed through hospital records. The numbers were disturbing. The mortality rate under Högel's shifts was shockingly high. Patients who should have survived were dying unexpectedly. But records weren't enough. The truth, buried beneath years of cover-ups and ignorance, required a more drastic approach. Authorities ordered the exhumation of bodies, over 130 in total. One by one, the graves of former patients were opened. Forensic experts tested tissue samples. Traces of heart drugs, ajmalin, sotalol, lidocaine, were found in victim after victim. Högel had left a signature. And now, it was being uncovered. For years, he had gotten away with it. And for years, hospitals had let him. Records revealed a chilling truth: both Oldenburg and Delmenhorst hospitals had noticed an unusual spike in deaths during his shifts. Instead of stopping him, they had allowed him to resign quietly, moving from one facility to another. They had sent a murderer into the arms of new victims. On June 6, 2008, Niels Högel stood trial for the murder of just a handful of his victims, those for whom evidence was strongest. Prosecutors accused him of administering deadly doses of medication, causing fatal cardiac arrests. He denied everything at first. Then, as the weight of the evidence pressed down on him, he admitted to killing. But only 5. A small fraction of the real number. In 2015, a second trial began. This time, the charges expanded. Investigators had connected him to at least 100 deaths, though the real toll was suspected to be even higher. Högel, now unable to hide behind lies, changed his story. He confessed to 55 murders. But even that wasn't the end. By the time the final trial concluded in 2019, forensic experts and investigators had reached a harrowing conclusion: Högel was responsible for at least 85 deaths. Possibly more than 200. He was sentenced to life in prison, marked as Germany's most prolific serial killer since World War II. The hospitals that had harbored Högel didn't escape scrutiny. Families of victims demanded answers. How had no one stopped him? Why had hospital administrators ignored the warning signs? In 2020, a series of hospital officials were put on trial for negligence. Some received fines. Others lost their medical licenses. But for the families, no punishment felt sufficient. Nothing could bring their loved ones back. Niels Högel was a nurse. Someone sworn to save lives. Instead, he took them, for sport, for attention, for a thrill only he understood. For 6 years, hospitals turned a blind eye. Lives were lost not just because of one man's monstrous actions, but because of a system that failed to intervene. Had someone spoken up sooner, had the warnings been heeded, hundreds might still be alive today. Instead, they rest beneath cold earth. Their names carved into history as victims of the nurse who was supposed to protect them. On June 6, 2019, after years of investigations, trials, and countless painful testimonies, justice was finally delivered. The court sentenced Niels Högel to life imprisonment. The judge declared the severity of guilt, a ruling that ensured he would never walk free again. It was the maximum sentence under German law, a rare but necessary measure to acknowledge the unimaginable scale of his crimes. But no sentence, no punishment, could erase the devastation he left behind. The sheer scale of his crimes made him one of history's most notorious serial killers, a man who had hidden behind a nurse's uniform while playing God with human lives. The families of the victims sat in court, their faces etched with grief, waiting to hear the words that would confirm what they had known in their hearts for years: their loved ones had been murdered, and the system had failed them. Some wept as the verdict was read. Others clenched their fists in silent fury. Their pain was immeasurable, their trust in the healthcare system shattered beyond repair. For many, the agony wasn't just that their relatives had been killed, it was that their deaths had been preventable. Had the hospitals acted sooner, had someone listened to the warnings, had accountability come before disaster, hundreds of lives might have been saved. Victim's son, translated. My father was in the hospital to get better. He was supposed to come home. Instead, we buried him. And for years, we didn't even know why. Victim's daughter. They called it natural causes. We believed them. We trusted them. I live every day knowing my mother was killed, and no one stopped him. The pain didn't stop with the families. It extended to the doctors and nurses who had worked alongside Högel, those who had unknowingly shared shifts with a killer. Many struggled with guilt, haunted by the question, could they have done more? Could they have stopped him? The Högel case sent shockwaves through Germany and beyond. The realization that a single nurse could carry out so many murders, unnoticed for years, exposed deep flaws within the healthcare system. How could no one have noticed? How could administrators have ignored the warnings? How many more cases like this existed, lurking beneath the surface? Nationwide reforms were implemented to ensure patient safety. Stricter monitoring of medication administration. Enhanced oversight of unusual death patterns in hospitals. A mandatory system for medical staff to report suspicious behavior without fear of retaliation. Hospitals that had once ignored red flags were now under scrutiny. Policies that had once prioritized reputation over accountability were being rewritten. The system had been forced to change, at a cost that could never be repaid. Niels Högel didn't kill in rage. He didn't kill for money. He didn't even kill out of negligence. He killed for the thrill. For the feeling of power. For the twisted high of bringing someone to the brink of death, and sometimes, pulling them back. A man entrusted with saving lives became a merchant of death. And the system built to protect the sick had allowed a predator to thrive within its walls. His victims were mothers, fathers, daughters, sons. People who should have gone home to their families. People who had put their faith in those sworn to heal them. They never got that chance. The case of Niels Högel stands as a chilling reminder of what happens when warning signs are ignored. When bureaucracy overshadows human life. When silence allows evil to flourish. How many more victims would be alive today, if someone had spoken up sooner? This case isn't just a dark chapter in history. It's a warning. A reminder that when red flags are ignored, lives are lost. What do you think? Who holds the most responsibility in this case? The hospitals that ignored the warnings? The colleagues who suspected but stayed silent? Or the system that allowed a killer to slip through the cracks? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. And if you found this story as haunting as we did, help us keep these cases in the spotlight. Like this video, subscribe and hit the bell icon, because every crime has a final truth, and together, we uncover it. Stay safe. Stay aware. And never be afraid to question the systems meant to protect us. Because sometimes, the real danger isn't in the shadows, it's right in front of us.